The Walking Dead had a lot of great eras.
I'm close to finding this girl. I just found a damn doll a few days ago.
You found her doll, Daryl. That's what you did. You found a doll.
You know what the hell you're talking about.
Some of them were good, and some of them were, well, questionable. But when you ask people about which one was their favorite, they'll probably all give you different answers. Some might say the best one was the farm era from season 2, or the prison era from season 3, and if they tell you it's the Commonwealth era, they're lying, because that's no one's favorite. But if you personally had to ask me what my favorite era of The Walking Dead was, I would definitely have to say the road era between seasons 4 and 5 of the show. And I feel like a lot of people do share the same sentiment because it's essentially where the show peaked in popularity. Like, this is actually hard to believe nowadays, but there was a time when The Walking Dead as a show was one of the biggest in television, like alongside shows like Game of Thrones, to the point where it was raking in tens of millions of viewers per episode, with season 5 gaining the most amount of average viewers per episode than any other season. And I don't think that it was coincidental that the show peaked around this era, because right after this is when the show's ratings started slowly dwindling. You know, when all the communities started being introduced and then eventually into the Savior's arc. And I believe that there is a specific reason as to why the Road era resonated so much with so many viewers. And I feel like that there's no better way to explain why other than to discuss the episode that, in my opinion, really defined this era's strong suit. And that episode is none other than season 5 episode 10, Them. Before we start diving deep into this, I think it's important to note the timing and placing of this episode throughout season 5. Episode 10 comes in the aftermath of all the stuff that went down in the first half of this season, with the major arcs being Terminus and the Atlanta hospital. These were highly pivotal moments in the show, and were actually some of the most traumatic for the main characters.
I already made you a promise.
I mean, they barely got out of Terminus if it wasn't for Carol and her master plan, and the trade with Officer Dawn in the hospital went south because Beth ended up dying. Then literally an episode after that, Tyrese also dies a very slow and painful death, making 2 major characters being killed in 2 consecutive episodes. So yeah, the guys are going through it. And on the other hand, this episode precedes what was to come next in the following ones, with the introduction of Aaron leading them to Alexandria, which marks the first major community Rick and the group form a part of.
If this is a trap to get us back where you want us, your people are gonna die tonight.
So episode 10 essentially acts as a sort of bridge to link between these 2 eras of the show, which in my opinion does really well and comes at the best timing to do this. So the episode itself revolves around Rick and his group being stranded on the road with literally nothing. They don't have food, water, and their car broke down, forcing them to walk on the road in the scorching heat. And the main goal for the episode is to just find some food and shelter and try to somehow recuperate after all the traumatic events from the previous episodes. They eventually manage to eat some food by killing a pack of wild dogs, where shortly after it rains, giving them a temporary supply of water. Daryl then informs the group that they can take shelter in a barn.
There's a barn! Where?
And they eventually spend the night there. And then the next morning, Maggie and Sasha head out where Aaron approaches them and says a quick hello.
Good morning.
And that's pretty much the plot of the entire episode. I mean, it's very simple, right? You can also consider it as a sort of filler episode, if you will, because technically nothing noteworthy really happens that moves the overall plot until Aaron shows up. But what makes this episode so special is not the plot that it revolves around, but rather it's the moment-to-moment interactions between the characters. You see, the plot being as simple as it is allows for a lot of room for some really substantial character development. We get to see how they individually behave with one another, considering their situation at that moment, especially with how each and every one of them is grieving after losing Beth and Tyrese in such a short time. And the theme of grief is heavily explored in this episode, with it being the central subject matter of the entire runtime. And the main grief is explored through three characters, those being Maggie, Daryl, and Sasha, who were the closest to Beth and Tyrese. The episode starts off with Maggie. She's crying, alone, as Walker approaches, which she barely gives any attention, almost like she doesn't even care if it gets close to her or not, showing how intense her grief is. Throughout the episode, we see Maggie trying to cope with her sister's loss by initially actually refusing to think about it. She wants to properly mourn her sister, but she feels like she can't because she's numb to it all, especially after the hope of seeing Beth after all that time was completely destroyed. We see her internalize her grief in many of the scenes in this episode. For example, when Father Gabriel offers his consolation, she dismisses him and tells him that he wouldn't understand since he didn't really know Beth and what she's been through.
I know you're in pain. You don't know shit.
This feeling of internalization is emphasized later on when she opens up a car trunk to find a tied up walker which looks eerily similar to Beth. This actually shocks Maggie, as it not only reminds her of her sister, but also the cruelty of this world, knowing that somebody out there was cruel enough to lock this girl up in this trunk and left her to die in turn. And what's interesting about this scene is Maggie's reaction to all this. Initially, she ignores it, but then she desperately wants to put this poor girl out of her misery. Her initial reaction to ignore it symbolizes her internalized grief. She wants to show it, but she feels like she can't. Shortly after, it's quickly overcome with a feeling of shame that she could not truly face it. Eventually, Maggie does start opening up about her feelings with Glenn. She started becoming more in tune with her feelings by openly expressing her dark, intrusive thoughts.
I don't know if I want to fight it anymore.
You do.
Similar to how she felt shame for not taking care of that walker, she now wants to come face to face with her loss. Later on, she has a similar encounter with another walker, but now in the barn, where this time she decides to kill it upon sight. She notices that this person had a gun, which she could have easily have used to stop herself from turning.
She had a gun. She could have shot herself.
Maggie is a very strong character. She's very smart and extremely resilient, ever since she was introduced back in season 2 basically. But that doesn't make her immune to feeling moments of intense emotional turmoil, because at the same time she's also a character who has lost a lot, including her entire family. And when Beth died, she felt like a part of her died as well, since she was the last relative survivor of her family. And at the same time, Maggie feels this sense of sort of survivor's guilt, because with Beth dying, she's the last remaining member of the Green family.
How much longer we got? 60 miles. I wasn't talking about that.
Daryl, on the other hand, handles Beth's loss in an entirely different way than Maggie. He often finds himself straying away from the group to be alone, which he actually does on 3 separate occasions in this episode alone.
I'm gonna head out. See what I can find.
Daryl has always been kind of a lone wolf. He likes to spend time alone in the wilderness and often keeps himself busy with activities like hunting or scavenging. But this time though, he does this as an excuse to isolate himself from the others. He does this because he feels like he shouldn't show his emotions in front of his friends because it would make him seem weak. And this is something which probably stems from his past trauma due to his abusive father, which he actually shared with Beth. The first time he strays away, Carol goes with him, who tries to give him words of encouragement to keep moving on.
I'm not dead.
She reminds him that they're still alive, and that matters, and that they should keep moving on. Which Daryl actually took her advice to heart, and we know this because he eventually contradicts Rick when he says that they are the Walking Dead.
Lead them.
This is something which Daryl has kept in mind over the years. To him, simply being alive is an achievement. Getting to wake up every day being alive gives Daryl a reason to keep fighting on. He separates himself from the walkers because ultimately they are the symbol of death and ultimate defeat.
got one enemy. We ain't the Walking Dead.
Eventually, we see the full extent of Daryl's isolated grief when he strays away from the group for the third time. This time he goes alone, without Carol. He goes out, finds an open space where he sits up against a tree and smokes a cigarette as he breaks down and weeps for Beth. This is probably one of the strongest scenes in the entire show. I mean, it's probably also the best Daryl scene ever. The way that Norman Reedus is able to convey such pure emotion in this one scene with no words being spoken is just excellent. I mean, with this one scene, you can really see how Daryl feels about all of this as he pours out all of his pent-up sadness and anger. He burns himself with a cigarette just to make him feel something, but he is so numb to it all that he doesn't even react. And what hurts even more for Daryl is him knowing that some of the last words he ever told Beth was that she was never going to see Maggie again, which in fact, she didn't.
No, you don't get it. Everyone we know's dead.
Don't know that!
Might as well, because you ain't never gonna see him again. Rick, you ain't never gonna see Maggie again.
Daryl, just
No.
stop!
During all this, Sasha is also trying to handle her own loss, but the way that Sasha mourns is vastly different from Daryl and Maggie. Rather than weeping or isolating herself, she feels anger, just pure rage and fury. And you can see this as she's constantly trying to release that anger by wanting to kill walkers. In the beginning of the episode, Rick warns the group not to take on a group of walkers that was following them because they're too weak.
We're not at our strongest. We'll get him when it's best.
They're dehydrated, hungry, and they don't have enough energy to kill them. However, Sasha suggests to Michonne that she would be able to handle them, but Michonne swiftly shuts her down because she knows that it's not a smart decision.
We can take him. Looks right. Barely have anything left.
Later on, they devise a plan to push these walkers off the side of a bridge, which was a smart way for them to take them on without using too much energy. But instead, Sasha decides to take this opportunity to kill these walkers head on. This obviously forces the group to directly engage with the walkers, where you can see it's not exactly their brightest day. Rick stumbles and almost falls, and he almost gets bitten if it wasn't for Daryl. And Sasha herself actually ends up slashing Abraham's arm because she was just so blinded by rage. Now, you could easily just blame Sasha for this for being quote-unquote selfish, but the group doesn't really blame her for that. They know that she's going through an extremely tough time, and it's hard for her to be stable, both physically and mentally. And right now, letting out her anger is the only way that she can cope with the loss of her brother. As you can see, these characters have extremely different methods for them to mourn. I mean, at this point, Daryl, Sasha, and Maggie are just so absolutely devastated and blinded by their anguish, because even in a moment of slight hope, when the rain comes, while everyone else is celebrating it, they don't, as their minds are just still preoccupied with their tremendous loss. And this brings back to a wider scope of the show, because one of the main draws of The Walking Dead was that it was famous for having these major character deaths, with the element of no one being safe being present throughout the whole show. And with death, obviously comes grief, which Season 5 Episode 10 dedicates its entire runtime for. Because this time, not only do we get to see the characters themselves mourn, but we see their coping mechanisms and how they each deal with it so differently. And personally, I believe it's a really good real-life example of showing how everyone mourns differently. But the main takeaway from these characters' sorrow is that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Because other than grief, hope is also a crucial theme explored in this episode. Daryl, Sasha, and Maggie all come to the realization that there is still hope outside of this pain. This hope is symbolized by a motif which represents these characters' journey, and this is done with a small music box that Carl gives to Maggie.
What is it?
I think it's used to play music. It's broken.
It's a very small gesture from Carl's part, right? And kind of random at the same time. Like, why is bro giving her a broken toy while she's at her lowest point she's ever been? But in that moment, Maggie really appreciates it, even though it is broken. This music box actually represents innocence, which at that moment was broken due to the loss that Maggie was feeling. But later on in the episode, Daryl fixes this box and gives it to Maggie again.
The gearbox has some grit in it.
Thank you.
The next morning, Maggie and Sasha head out to see the rising sun. The rising sun itself inspires them, letting them know that in a dark and brutal world, there is still beauty. Maggie tries winding up the music box, but at first it doesn't work. But then when Aaron comes in, the music box starts playing at once, signifying the hopeful future that they might have. The journey of this music box reflects the characters' personalities throughout this episode. At first, the box is dirty and broken, just like Maggie and the others who feel completely torn apart. But then when they find some food and shelter, some of that hope is regained, especially when the characters come into terms with their loss and reality and start looking forward toward the future. And that hope is then further ignited when Aaron comes in, which is when the music box starts playing at once. But other than Daryl, Sasha, and Maggie, we also get to see how the other characters are holding up. To understand their mindset at this point, basically, this is the group at some of their absolute lowest. Because other than trying to cope with the loss of two beloved members, they also have to come to the realization of their dire situation on the road. The growing starvation and thirst definitely takes a toll on these characters, as it totally makes their mental process much worse. And you can see this by how each and every one of these characters are moving. They're walking very slowly, they're barely able to speak with each other, and they're visibly losing hope with each passing second.
I truly do not know if things can get worse.
It's also probably the time when the group was at its most primal and feral with the way that they had to eat wild dogs because they had no choice. And a lot of these characters are actually being demoralized because of this, and they lose hope that things will ever get better. Abraham, for example, who in the midst of dying thirst, he indulges himself in hard liquor, and he resorts to drinking alcohol not to quench his thirst, obviously, but to numb the pain that he feels with every step he makes, even though he knows that it will only make him more dehydrated.
It's not gonna help. He knows that.
You also have Noah, who is actually new to the group. He tells Sasha that he doubts if he'll make it, foreshadowing his brutal and untimely death later on.
I don't know if I'm gonna make it.
Then you won't.
And these words from Noah impact Sasha so much that she started reflecting on them in the final scene of the episode, where she herself feels that she won't make it either.
You're gonna make it. Both of us, we will.
And the last person that I expected to lose hope was actually Father Gabriel. Gabriel's loss in hope is symbolized by his white collar, a central piece of Catholic priest's garment. Initially, he holds on to it, even though he feels really hot, while he lightheartedly explains its importance to Maggie. He did this mainly in order for him to show that he's not giving up, and neither should Maggie. And he's not giving up on his hope, and not on his faith.
I used to joke these things were leftovers from the days of hair shirts.
However, shortly after, we see him taking off the collar and throwing it in the fire when they're eating the dogs. At this point, he feels that their situation has become so desperate that his faith was the last thing on his mind, which actually even surprises Maggie, even though she's not religious. But then when it starts raining, Gabriel has a change of heart. He pours his heart out and begs for forgiveness, as he believes that the rain was a sign of mercy from God. And speaking about hope, not every character in this episode is wallowing in their sorrows. Some characters in the group actually hold on to the little hope that they have left and try to use that to encourage the others to keep fighting for themselves. Rick obviously being one of them. Rick, being the leader of the group, is focused on keeping them together by leading them and calling out most of the shots, such as the timing of them to take on the walkers.
High ground, something like that. They're not going anywhere.
And it's not to say that Rick himself is not going through his own process of grieving, but he tries to bury his sorrow in order to stay strong for the group, because as a weak leader, he would demoralize the group even further. And instead of breaking down, he keeps moving on, clinging on to that last bit of hope that he has left to keep the group motivated. This is particularly exemplified when they take shelter in the barn and he tells them of his story about his grandfather, which is just one of the most iconic scenes and monologues in the entire show. He explains his rationale when it came to this world and how the group has to survive, pretending that they're dead, simply surviving, and then they get to live. Hence, him saying that they were the walking dead, similarly to how his grandfather told himself that he was dead during the war.
We do what we need to do, and then we get to live. We tell ourselves that we are the walking dead.
Other than Rick, who obviously is the leader, another character instilling hope is Glenn. As we all know, Glenn has always been sort of the glue of the group. He focuses on keeping everyone together, even during the toughest of times. Similar to Rick, he's a character who puts his friends and family's well-being before himself, as you can see when he offers water to Maggie and Daryl, even though they didn't want it.
Daryl.
Don't.
He consoles Maggie and tells her to keep fighting on when she felt like giving up, which gives her the energy she needed to keep moving on.
We fought to be here. And we have to keep fighting.
Glenn is just one of the last hopes of humanity. He still believes in the notion of being kind and the strength in numbers, while he's also generous and completely selfless.
We can make it together. But we can only make it together.
Now that we've covered how each and every significant character in this episode has played their roles in the group, you can see that by all of these personalities working and coming together and surviving, they end up forming not just a survivor group, but a family. This is a family which endures, survives, overcomes, and ultimately lives. And with this episode highlighting the group at their absolute lowest, it allows us to see them in their most vulnerable states yet. But it's that idea of clinging on to the last bit of hope that they have, which allows them to keep living and moving on even when the situation is at its most dire. And this actually brings me back to the original statement on why this episode absolutely defines this era of The Walking Dead. This very episode, in my opinion, is just the culmination of why this show peaked in season 5. People just absolutely love seeing simple plots like this, where we have a whole episode of the group finding water, but it allows for some of these great character interactions which we wouldn't have otherwise. It was a time which only consisted of the main small group who we all grew accustomed to, like Rick, Daryl, Maggie, Michonne, Abraham, and every single other one. And it also preceded all of the grandiosity of the big communities and civilizations that we see in the later seasons, which a lot of people unfortunately really tuned out of. And you also have to give this episode some credit with it containing some of the most iconic and best scenes that this show has to offer. From Rick's speech in the barn, to Daryl's scene in the woods, the rain scene, all the scenes on the road, they're just all so iconic. But most importantly, just like the music box, Season 5 Episode 10 just hits every single core theme that the show revolves around. Tragedy and misery, but ultimately leads to hope.